And, at some point in the story, we assume well, we know what's happening, but Penelope is not quite sure if Odysseus is still alive. Telemachus, his son, he's mourning. He's not quite sure his father's still alive. And I use that's the structure of that story to kind of talk about my own grief. But I also contradict that in many points in the book because I move in time. Like sometimes the father is alive, sometimes he's kind of like a ghost character inhabiting the world around me. And that feels more real to me because, when you encounter grief, it's not linear. You encounter the person through your memories, and those change the further away you get from the loss that happens. And as you evolve, your perception of the person changes. The good, the bad, whatever it is. So eventually, you reach a point where you just have your memory and your image of the person, which is always going to be flawed in some ways. You can never know a person all the way through. So I took that conceit and went with it with the book, that I'm like, oh no, I'm going to mythologize this person who obviously I know him, he's my blood, but he was very much a mystery to me in many ways. And so using the framework that was already there for the Odyssey helped me to kind of tap into that and be able to move in time in ways that was convenient for me as a storyteller.
Thank you.
Sure. I'll take a try at it. I think I just gave up the idea that I would ever have a linear narrative, because my experience of grief and the experiences of grief I was writing about, none of them were linear, and a lot of them I think were, several of the deaths I was writing about were unexpected. And so I think I really leaned into this kind of collage form where I was blending personal narrative with images from horror films and pop culture references or song lyrics. And in some ways, these images or these tropes that I was relying on were things that kind of pulled me through the grief, but they also kind of stood up as larger cultural truths that kind of I clung to in those times as I was moving through the grief. But definitely the collage form lent itself to that irregularity and the total lack of narrative that I was able to not piece together as I moved through grief. But I like what you said, Maya, about the further you get from being in the presence of someone, the hazier those memories become, and it becomes harder to really piece together who a person was. So you kind of have to sometimes divine intervention, rely on other things, and maybe a spark sometimes.
Yeah, I think in my case too, the grief that I was exploring in All's Well is not linear, and it was a grief. It was kind of the loss of self, because the protagonist in that story suffers from chronic pain and was an actor on the stage, and then just lost that life and has to kind of embrace this new reality that they really don't want to accept. So yeah, that's not a linear experience either, because in the story she's always looking backward. She's so nostalgic for this past self, that she once was, and that sort of breeds this very, very intense wish, this longing to return. And the story is really exploring that sort of very fairy tale, careful what you wish for, kind of narrative structure. And so it was fairy tale that sort of carried me along, just thinking about structure. And then also the two plays that I was dealing with in the book. So one is All's Well That Ends Well by Shakespeare, which is a comedy. And comedies are great because they sort of start in a rocky spot, but then they have like a rising arc. So that was really useful because Miranda does experience a kind of healing, but it's not an essential healing, right? It's not really the healing that she needs. She has to go through like another dark passage to get there.
Thank you so much.
I don't think so. Is mine?
I think it is. Yeah. Let's see. Oh,
Yeah, there you go.
Maybe the weird ones earlier was from me. So Mona, you actually transitioned this perfectly into my next question. Thank you. So in our class, we were talking about who we would want to put on each of these panels, and we chose the three of you because we saw different kinds of grief popping up in your stories. Mona, you said you write about a loss of self. Maya, you write about a loss of another person, and Gina, you sort of write about both of those things throughout your essays. So I'm curious how you see people grieving differently for each of those types of loss, and how did you differentiate between those types of loss in your writing? Anyone can go.
I'll start. In my case, it was sort of just to kind of return to that idea of looking backward. That's really the danger that I think can arise when you're grieving the loss of this sense of who you were, and that's gone. You can just look back at that and want to live in the past. And so Miranda is inhabiting the past far too much. And that causes a kind of blindness. I mean, she can't really fully accept her new reality. She's just in this place of just longing and despair. So her experience of life is just, it's so much more narrow because of that. So I was really interested in that. I was interested in how that sort of grief can really blind you to the possibilities of the present moment. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that for me, the way I think of grief and loss is very much like what does absence look like, and what is the shape of that? What is the feel of that? You know, we define the absence of something by the context, like what is around it. So I wasn't really interested or able to access my own grief in a more direct way. So I use the other characters. And I say characters because there are like the real people, and then there's the kind of veil of fiction or that I use. So, there's the characters in the Odyssey and how they're responding to the absence of Odysseus. And so I was able to use that to talk about grief. And just another note on like the personal element here. We talk about, I'm sure you've encountered this in workshops, distinguishing the I in the work versus the speaker. And obviously it's really, when you have a work like mine, it's very kind of fluid. And I still consider it me in a sense, but it's very intentional that the speaker is not physically present throughout most of the book. The speaker, everything is very much like funneled through her perspective, but you don't actually see her interacting with the other characters or interacting with the world directly as much, because there is that kind of distance of a narrator, a distance that is kind of replicating the same distance that like Homer had, or not to compare myself to Homer because Jesus. But the book is very much aware that I am here participating in my grief in a very specific way that I'm channeling through this art. And so, I don't know, that's mainly my thought.
Thank you. I think that for me, I hadn't really expected, I guess when I started Night Rooms, I think initially I was like, I'm not really writing about myself, which is, I think, one way you trick yourself into thinking you're not writing about yourself, and eventually you are. And you kind of walk into that room and you're like, oh damn, I'm here now. And you can stay or you can go. Like that's always a choice you get to make as a writer. I really don't like when people are like, oh, I just found myself here and I had to do it. It's like, no, you can leave anytime. But I found myself, kind of like, well, writing into this space where I was like, yeah, these are different kinds of griefs, the grief of losing other people. I also felt this sense of urgency, almost like, I think in grief, like omens and signs suddenly seem like valid for some weird reason. Like everything seems like it means something, or even if it doesn't, like, oh, that bird over there, like everything just took on extra significance. So writing about various suicides in the essays, I found myself, I kept coming back to like my own mental health and experiences in my own life, and was like, I keep coming back to this place and was like, well, I'm going to try and write about these experiences. And I think having the horror movies was a way to kind of like feel like I had an out, or at least some other signpost to guide me. I think too, I was also very emboldened by this insistence that we have conversations about mental health, but only in particular contexts. So I kind of wanted to see if maybe I could try it my own way. And this was that for me. So.
Great, thank you. I feel like the three of you are reading over my shoulder the questions I have written down. Because my next one is about, well, each of you reference different texts in your work. Gina, you talk about all these different movies. You talk about the Odyssey, and obviously All's Well That Ends Well. I was curious how referencing other texts helped you work through your own writing and the emotions that came with that process.
I mean, it gives you a kind of freedom, and I think it can also be kind of a radical act, especially for me being, a Black woman, taking a classical text and making it a story that's very personal to me. Because I've always been interested in various mythologies from the time I was a kid, especially like Greco-Roman. And I should note that it's mostly the Odyssey, but there are other kind of mythologies present in the text and mythological stories in there. But I feel like using that was like, it felt really freeing that I always had this attachment to these stories, but here I am creating an actual tangible link to them that now when I come back to these stories, there is a bit of me in it and there's a bit of my family in it. And I think hopefully for other readers who, are living in this contemporary world, who are suffering with grief or suffering with something, that they can access this text in a new way that perhaps may not have been accessible to them before.
Yeah, same here. I mean, I got really just so excited by Shakespeare, and I was reading these plays when I was struggling with chronic pain, and I remember just being so exhilarated by the structure of the plays and the possibilities and how they spoke to just my predicament, and that's the wonderful thing about Shakespeare. There's so much openness there for you to read yourself in the stories, and I think that's why they can stay so fresh and so contemporary. So it was really exhilarating to work with, and it gave me shape, it gave me structure, which was wonderful too. But I have to say, and I don't know if you felt this way, Maya, but I was scared too. I was scared to work with Shakespeare. It felt like, oh gosh, I don't know if I can do this. But that was part of the fun, that it was a little scary and intimidating to me.
Well, yeah. Can I say one or two? Like, Shakespeare is so interesting because there's so many problems with, literally problems, like All's Well that Ends Well. But like, in terms of the politics, in terms of racial politics, gender politics, like there's a lot there that you can challenge Shakespeare on.
Right.
And, bring your own voice in.
Yeah.
Like, that's really fun.
Yeah, exactly. That was really, really fun. Yeah.
I think that a lot of writing ends up being in conversation, well, not only with our world, but with other writing, like it or not. Like, you're reading other people, you're responding to them in some way. And I think, Night Rooms was a very active engagement with horror texts and with poetry. Specifically, I think the first movie I saw that, like, where it really clung to me in a way where I was like really excited to work with it and really excited to sink into it and explore some of these feelings alongside films was the movie It Follows. For some reason, that movie just stuck to me and I couldn't stop thinking about it. So in a lot of ways, I think for me, it was engaging these texts was a thing of obsession. And it was kind of I think there are a lot of writers where they just become fascinated with something or they can't get away from something and you go down the rabbit hole with it and just follow it until you make something cool or bail on it, only to inevitably come back to it maybe, I hope. But yeah, I love that, like texts that are made based on obsession or just the inability to get away from something.
Thank you. Those are such interesting answers. So in the room with us, and specifically in our class, we have a lot of people who are writers, who are trying to sort of venture into writing, and want to write about heavy topics like the things that you cover in your stories. And I think it was one of our student guides, Rachel, who actually phrased this question for me. But we were wondering, she said, how do you fill your cup? How do you work with topics like this in a way that feels sustainable and healthy, and restorative rather than just triggering and hurtful?
Can I be honest?
Sure.
Therapy. Like, I really mean that. Like, you hear a lot, I think we nonfiction writers and poets hear this question a lot, like, are you worried what other people are going to think? And I wish more and more we ask, are you taking care of yourself? Are you being taken care of? Like, I really mean that. Like, take good care of yourself and do your work. Like, do your work and think of it as work. Think of it as I am doing my job. And yes, go to therapy if you can. Like, and then hopefully you'll be in a place where you can work and you're able to do meaningful creative work, because the myth of the like languishing artist who's depressed and can't, do their work, that's really sad. Because that's someone who's not able to create and make things. So yes, therapy.
I agree with therapy. I'm such a fan. I'm like such a nutbag, I'm telling you. Yeah, I will say I have a different take on that last part though, because I actually really do like reveling in my depression and stuff when I have it, and I will like kind of use that to write, and it will actually feel cathartic to me. I know that's not true of everyone, but it is. I still am prolific when I'm really sad, which is fortunate for me. But I also think that we shouldn't disregard the catharsis that is the process of writing, and that is the process of reading a really difficult text. Because it's like, if you go to see like a really sad movie, like going in what you're in for, and you still go and you're still gonna cry. And like, it's kind of like that when you pick up a book about grief or loss or whatever it is. And the other thing I'll say is that for me personally, like I've said this before, as we've been talking, but not here, earlier, I think. I have no concept of time. That's another problem. That like I have a really kind of dark, sarcastic sense of humor. And so that, it's been noted, comes out in my book sometimes too, that I was like, I would have like weird dreams about my father, or I would have like weird kind of thoughts throughout the day. I'd be like, oh, it would be weird if my like dead father was here for this. And I was like, oh, I'll just write that as a poem. And so like my dad popping up and like being late for his own funeral or something like is a premise that comes up. And it's not like I went in and trying to be funny, but I think it just came out of necessity, that there is a kind of humor to tragedy. And talking about Shakespeare,
Yeah.
a lot of the comedies are really messed up.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, like, just because it ends in a marriage doesn't mean everything's happy. Jesus Christ. Like, Merchant of Venice, like, come on, guys. So, like, I feel like that also is part of the tragic experience. There is some humor there. There is some kind of ridiculousness to the existential problem of being a human being in the world. And, you know, I like to draw from that too. And that can make the really, really kind of unrelenting dark things a little bit lighter.
Yeah, I so agree with that. And it's so true. The comedies are disturbing. And then the tragedies have these moments of comedy. They're just incredible, you know? Or room at least to bring a comedic reading to a particular line or a particular scene or moment or silence. And I love that because I also feel that way. I just, you know, I tend to be, and I always have been extremely, extremely like dark-minded, but then at the same time, there's always a part of me that's laughing, even when I'm like really, really scared or sad. I can't help it, and that's always been the case. And I do think it's a coping mechanism, and it's a way that I deal with pain or feelings of powerlessness. I also think in some ways, the reason why humor keeps coming into moments of pain, at least in my own fiction, is because it seems to me that it's part of the truth of the experience. And so to not include it would be to be excluding part of the truth. And the other thing that I'll say for fiction writers who are grappling, my first book was it was drawing from a lot of personal stuff that was very, very hard for me. It took me years and years to write that book because it felt so personal. And I really, really struggled with some of the stories. Like I just really struggled to write them because it was just hard. It was like revisiting moments that felt hard. And I'll never forget like this moment where I sort of broke through. I was working on a story about my mother who had passed away. And I was stuck in this particular scene. She passed away in real life, and in the book she also passes away, this fictional mother. I was stuck in the scene and I couldn't find my way out of writing it, just this very, very like conventional structure. And I remember going through boxes of her stuff and then finding these really ridiculous pink shoes that she had bought me. And those shoes were like some kind of key that opened a door to this other way of seeing her and the whole situation. And I saw the potential for play and humor and fantasy in this moment that was otherwise just one level. And that was just the most exhilarating thing, like finding play and possibility and fun in a moment that I thought was just dark and sad. So yeah, it's just finding that, letting yourself sort of find that key. It's an intuitive thing. And sometimes it can take time, but that's my way of kind of when I see that I'm stuck in that sort of place and I can get there sometimes, I remember that shoe and then I think, okay, I'll just wait for the shoe. It'll come, whatever the shoe is in that context. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Again, leading me so perfectly into our next question. When we were talking about the works in our class, another one of our guides made an observation about a pattern he noticed in all of your writings, talking about how the grief presented in your stories is surrounded on, maybe not all sides, most sides, by love in some form or another. And we were wondering where you include love in your writings about loss. Where do you see your characters encountering love in their journeys of grief?
Well, that's the thing that makes grief so unbearable, is because it's written from a place of losing someone you love, right? Like assuming you miss the person who is no longer among you. So it's the act of writing out of grief or from grief is an act of love. But I also think writing into love, writing into warmth, whether that's the love of a partner, the love of animals. My husband's joke to me, you can't throw a stone in my book without finding a cat. Also the natural world, like I spend a lot of time in Inca gorges in my essays. There's a lot of circularity there. So I think for me, there was a sense of like finding myself still tethered to this world and the people who are still here and animals and the trees and all that. Not to get too hippie and but I do live here, so I suppose I'm obligated to love it. But I do think that love can be a tether when you feel kind of like unmoored by the overwhelming grief. But yeah, I think that too, in and of itself, comes from love. It hurts because you love the person you lost.
I feel like I'm trying to figure out how way to say this without making this into a therapy session, like sharing way too much information about my messed up family. But one of the ways I feel like I got into, the kind of grief around my father was to look at it from the perspective of my mother and to examine their marriage and the kind of grief that came with them getting separating a year before he died. So like that was, I feel like that allowed me to access a certain kind of love for my mother. I love my mother, of course. She's a total batshit crazy, but I love her. And having that kind of empathy for that kind of heartbreak and like how she still was there for me through that. But I think it's difficult with my father because he's a person who, of course, I loved him, but I didn't always like him, which is a phrase he used to always say. And, we had a very rocky relationship. And I think the book also allowed me to tap into empathy for him in a way that I may not have always been able to when he was alive. And it's kind of selfish of me to do that, but it's ultimately what we do as artists anyway. Goes back to my point about kind of recreating someone who you've lost and recreating that person through the art. And in order to write about him and to write about my family, I had to kind of step into perspectives that I didn't consider before. And, actually step into the empathy for these characters. And, that empathy is a form of love. And that is what we're doing, I think, when we're creating this kind of art.
Yeah, I agree. I think also what Gina was saying about just love just being inherent in grief, right? You're grieving because you love. It's intimidating to kind of take it on. Just to give language to it feels sometimes so difficult because it just doesn't feel like there can be words, or you can never fully capture the moment. So I think what I do is humor is a big thing. Humor is really important, and then also just not trying to capture the whole, just going with fragments. Sometimes can be a way to express, I think, the love that's bound up in grief. And even express the loss, right? The fragments kind of help, I think, to express the loss. So yeah, it's just kind of being, I think, patient with yourself as a writer, and just going moment to moment and just narrating what you experience moment to moment when you're experiencing your grief. Yeah, and letting the humor come in, I think is important too.
Thank you. Switching gears just slightly, another one of the things about the three of you that makes your work a little bit different is that you all decided to write about this process of grief through different forms. Right? We have a novel, we have a collection of poems, and we have a collection of essays. And I'm curious what drew you to those forms. Obviously, if you're more comfortable with a form, that makes sense. But I'm curious how you think your form of writing is maybe well suited to tackle the theme of grief.
That's a great question. I'll start. I love novels so much. And it's funny because I started off as a poet, and I still love poetry, and I'm just blown away by people who write it because I struggle with it now. I struggle with it now. I really do. But the reason I think I love novels now is because they're worlds, or they feel like worlds that I can live in for a very long time, and I love that about them. And that it's so strange because at the same time I love what poetry offers too, which is that compression, that just experience of a particular moment. With a novel, you're there for a while. But there's something about that kind of slipping into this other world that really works for me. And that now I've really, really grown very, very attached to. So I don't know, I think it depends on just the way that you like to dream, how you like to dream. And I like to kind of be with something expansively, rather than just for a moment. But I love as a reader to be in a moment with a poem. So and those inspire me in my novel writing.
Can we just take a moment to admire you saying that's how you love to dream? How did you just go up with that on the panel? Jesus Christ. Sorry, we talked about signs earlier, and I'm definitely a Leo. I'm having a Leo moment again. Yeah, for me, again, I can't write fiction. So, but the other part of it is that there is a long tradition of poems about grief within poetry. It's a whole form. And, specifically with the Greeks too, there's I use this image in at least one poem, that there's the kind of the women who would tear their hair and beat their chests in grief after their husbands were killed in the war or whatever. And I very much had that in mind, and the differences in how we express grief, or how grief was expressed in that time versus how we express grief now. And I think also, speaking to, Mona, your point about compression, what really appeals to me in poetry is that you have so much white space on the page. You have those zoras, and you have the spaces between the lines, the spaces between the words. And I use that in some poems more than others, but those spaces, and I've been asked this question before, why do you have all these spaces between these? Because those spaces is where the grief lives a lot of the time. Those are the spaces where kind of I exist in the silence that is kind of the feelings. The silence that is the feelings about this experience, and I really admire when fiction can go to that place, but I don't really have as much of interest in my own work of creating that expansiveness. I just like to pare back, and I like to sit with kind of the silence, like sitting in an empty room. There's something really vulnerable, intimate, and kind of scary about that. And I just find that preferable. Also because I'm an introvert, I like silence.
The space for the feelings.
Don't quote me on that. Mona's quote was better.
I want a t-shirt with both. So it's kind of interesting. I also started as a poet, and I think in its earliest forms, the first essay I tried to write, there were attempts to try and write poetry. There was movement around the page. There were just all kinds of things, and I just was like, this doesn't work. We're just gonna do some prose poems, one prose poem after another, because that was my chosen form when I was writing poetry. And so that shift from poem to essay or to nonfiction didn't feel like too jagged a departure for me, because I feel like a lot of poets do that. A lot of writers switch back and forth. What was interesting to me was that I had actually submitted the book as a lyric memoir. That's what I called it. That's what I thought of it as for years. And it wasn't until like one of my editors was just like, so we need a subtitle on this. And he sent back like essays, and I was like, or lyric memoir, and he just put essays again. And I was like, cool, this is like a marketing conversation. And I know certainly there are writers who like have their reasons, and they have the concrete, like probably way smarter than I am, who have their reasons for why they choose those forms or those words. But to me, I'm kind of like, cool, fluidity. Like if it's a lyric memoir to you, great. If it's essays to you, cool. I mean, I think the book actually does say essays, but so it's an essay collection, wink. But I'm pretty like, okay. I mean, if you want, it's nonfiction. I think that's the main key. And I'm sure like there are very valid reasons for like having a clear sense of why you do what you do. But to me, it was just this fluid, long nonfiction piece for the longest time. But I think in my mind, I always thought lyric memoir, but that may just be like my Maggie Nelson thing. Because of course I have one of those.
I mean, come on, you have good taste.
Right. It's a good thing to have. But yeah, I just felt like going between poetry and essays or nonfiction, whatever you want to call it, it does feel like a natural swerve.
Thank you. So now I'm gonna open it up to our audience. Take questions. We have time for probably between 1 and 3 questions. Whatever you're feeling. April.
I was just wondering if, obviously with grief there's different forms of it, and I feel like you all come into contact with this idea of like feminine grief and how that pops up throughout history. And I was wondering if you were conscious of the idea of feminine grief as something being like quiet, subdued, or if you were like thinking of it in terms of this loud, violent, like tearing apart of the self, like if you were conscious of that when you were writing your works, and if you wanted to challenge that in any way, or if you wanted to play with that idea.
Good question. Jesus, April, good for you. I know when it comes to my book, I was very aware of kind of gendered expressions of various other feelings, but I feel like I didn't really focus on how gendered grief can be. So there are definitely like women who are angry. There's a poem in the voice of, the Furies. And like, I'm drawn to them because obviously they are these feminine entities that are just full of rage and they're violent. But in terms of the grief itself, I think I'm mostly kind of went the autobiographical route, that I thought about the way that the women in my family express their grief. And, for a lot of us, it is quiet, and you can unpack that with the socially, in terms of like what it means to grieve as a woman, what it means to grieve as a Black woman, how loud you're allowed to be. But for me, it was just, I was more drawn to the silence because the way I saw that grief exhibited by the women in my family was like, it was very contained, and there was something tempestuous to that just having it enclosed in the space of a body, as opposed to letting it out into the air. So that just basically worked better for me, for my characters.
Yeah, in my case, I think where I really thought about gender was just in the way that my character suffers from chronic pain and tries to express that, and is just dismissed pretty much by everyone, or just not. She's never really listened to, not by doctors, not by physical therapist that's supposed to be working with her, not by her bosses, not by her colleagues. There's just always this kind of like diminishing of her experience. So she stops talking about it really outwardly. And then that's why the book is so interior in terms of the way in which she expresses it to the reader. And I always imagined, this actor who can no longer act on stage, when she's kind of in her head and disclosing to the reader how she's feeling, what I really imagine is that she's on stage in her mind, finally getting to tell an audience, what she's really feeling, because nobody outside is really listening. So that's how gender informed the pain in All Is Well.
Yeah, I think throughout Night Rooms, I was thinking a lot about a lot of final girls, a lot of women in horror, and the different, and maybe not so final girls, the ones who didn't survive to the end. And throughout the book, there are these little vignettes portraying different scenes from horror films. So there are those different manifestations of grief. In one case, it's a dancer who's just basically been told she's got to leave the academy, and she's crying as she's leaving, and there's this brutal dance scene that takes place. So that's this very violent manifestation of grief. But then there's also this very subdued moment in the woods among some trees in Eyes Without a Face that I was really drawn to. Or this very bold moment at the end of A Nightmare on Elm Street, where Nancy's standing up to Freddy. So I think a lot of those women and girls were in my mind as I was writing, and I was writing about them, but I was also, carrying that lineage and thinking of those different manifestations of these very intense feelings.
Thank you, April. That was a great question. Do you have any other questions? Nick, go ahead.
Hi. I was wondering about how much the perception of grief informed the writing process of the outside perception. I think it was Maya who had somewhere the word that's like, oh, I do this, it's wrong, I do this, it's wrong. So whether that be a reader perception or an outside character perception, in this case, I was just wondering what the perception of either outside characters or outside readers of that informed how you wrote grief.
There's this moment, I don't know if this speaks to your question, but the first thing I thought of is there's this moment in All's Well where Miranda's kind of on the floor and two of her colleagues are sort of standing over her, and they're asking if she wants some help. And she plays through the possibilities in her head. Like if she says yes, then they'll say she's always asking for help. But if she says no, she never asks for help. And like the judgment sort of inherent in each one, like how it could go. So yes, just this hyper awareness of like, if just any expression of pain at all, it could be spun if the person is in the mood to spin it, in this really judgmental way. And then the paralysis of that, right? That how much that kind of silences you. So I don't know if that is addressing your question, but that's what came up for me. And that definitely informed the way in which, my character expresses their grief, which is, no, I'm going to retreat inward and I'm going to go to my imaginary stage and to my imaginary audience. It's always there for me. And that's where I'm really going to say, like, what I'm really feeling, which is exhilarating, but again, it's this imagined audience.
I think I don't have a sociology degree. Imagine if I did. But there's a certain element of performance to every time we interact with another person. And that can be conscious or it can be subconscious. And I think with grief, a lot of times there is an element of performance to it. And I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way. I mean that as just that's how it is a lot of times way. Like, we live in a society with other people, and so like we get this feedback of like, oh no, you should act this way, or like if you're not crying, if God forbid, there are people who like laugh, like you were saying, like that's looked down upon. You can't be cracking up in the middle of a funeral. So I think I was aware of that to some degree. One of my poems is actually like formatted in. It's like a broken sonnet, but it's delivered in the form of like a scene from a play. And also a poem near the end I have, it's just, I don't even remember the name of the poem. But it goes through kind of the expectations of the hero character near the end of the story, how the hero character looks when he dies, or how he kind of ends his journey. And there are expectations for that. And, that is also fascinating to me, that there is a whole kind of performance and industry around death. And that's just something that's part of our society, and we just go along with it. But if you really think about it, it's very bizarre. Like, even the fact that, I don't know if you guys have heard this, but there's, I don't know, in some cultures, in some countries, there's like, you can hire grievers to come. And like, I find that fascinating, because like, what does that say about how easy or difficult it is to access grief and to express it, and like what is acceptable within that? That's it. That's my thought.
Yeah, no, the performance aspect though, that's something that like I think about a lot. I thought about it a lot while working on night rooms. I thought a lot about the kind of polite ways we're supposed to talk about something that can be just really awful. Well, I mean, it is awful. Like, and it can be really stuttering, really incoherent and all over the place. And we have to kind of find these tidy frameworks for it. But one of the nice things about writing, whether you're working in a linear narrative or collage form or any form, really, is you get to do whatever you want. And then you can kind of prune it back later, or edit, or I hope you edit, or revise. But those earliest drafts, I mean, I feel like that for me was an enormous gift, was those earliest drafts. And it goes back to what you were saying earlier, Maya, about like the cathartic element, like, because I really don't like that that's a dirty word, like, now. I mean, I find myself like sometimes like, it's not catharsis, but it's like, you know what, yeah, like when you're really sad, like just sitting down and writing, like, you don't have to publish that, like you can after you edit it, but that free space where like you really don't have to worry about the performative nature of it, and that you can curate it later and decide how you will present your grief. There is something really beautiful and moving about that. And I think it's also shifting from a place of grieving that kind of immediate urgent state to a place of mourning and memorializing, and that really like beautiful, like ongoing space where the person lives and in that capacity.
Thank you. And thank you, May, for that question. That was wonderful. I believe that's all we have time for. So I want to thank the three of you for being here, for sharing your stories with us. Thank you.
live streams all festival long. If you can't make it back into the rooms, I hope you can catch us online. Search New Voices Festival on YouTube. And I hope to see you at the creative performance at 5:30 in Presser Hall, or back here to hear some of the work of Gina, Maya, and Mona at 6:30. And then back for more tomorrow. Check our website. Thanks, everybody.